Thank you very much for coming. And I've told that it's always good to start with a joke. So I have one for you. Osama bin Laden is dead, and Al-Qaeda is on the ropes. Actually, we know that now, all this time after the president was reelected, while going around the country saying that it's anything but the truth, and that the world is in flames, the Middle East is in flames, and it's only getting worse. And I hate to say I told you so, but not really that much. Because all of this could have been foreseen, was foreseen, could have been prevented, was not prevented. And it was not prevented because of a willful ignorance and willful blindness that persists to this day and may be stronger than ever. And I'll give you an example. Just a few days ago, you may have seen it. Our friend Andy was among a panel that was on Hannity discussing the threat of, what did they call it, radical violent extremism or something like that. And the next day, or sometime shortly thereafter, CNN followed up on it with a debate or a discussion or a yell fest, whatever you may call it, between Linda Sarsour, who is a prominent Islamic activist in New York, and Brigitte Gabriel of Act for America, who I'm sure you all know. And mostly it was Linda shouting down Brigitte and the moderator shouting down Brigitte, and Brigitte getting very little time to speak. But one of the things that struck me about it was that Linda Sarsour actually took it upon herself, without a trace of irony or humility for that matter, to dictate to Brigitte. And she said, I want you to start speaking about extremism in general. And we have to understand that there are extremists of all kinds. And we should not and must not single out Muslims as extremists, because there are all kinds of extremists committing acts of violence around the world. Now, this is actually the dominant mainstream view, as any of you know if you read the papers and keep up with and watch the news and keep up with these things. You know that it's part of the official dogma of the mainstream media and the United States government, that it's all just a problem of radical violent extremists, and that they're extremists of all kinds, and that it's particularly racist, hateful, and bigoted to single out Muslims and to pretend that they're the only radical violent extremists. Have you ever heard that?
Yeah.
All the time.
Yeah. 10, 20 times a day, maybe? And the fact is that analysis in itself is part of the reason why we're in the fix we're in today, if not the primary reason. And I'll explain this to you. In the first place, it is deeply insidious, because when you start casting about for the extremists who are not Muslims, who can be the counterpart of the so-called Muslim extremists, well, it's very hard to find them. And when you start talking about Christian extremists, people mention inevitably Timothy McVeigh. Timothy McVeigh, who has been dead for how many years now, and who blew up the Oklahoma City building, what was it, 1985? 95?
Yeah.
And I thought it was longer ago, but in any case, very long time ago. Has no following, represents no movement, is not part of any group, was not even, in fact, a professing Christian at the time that he did the bombing. Only later became a convert to Christianity, and so thus became forever after the Christian extremist. But there have been over 20,000 Islamic Jihad attacks around the world since 9/11. And there was, on the other side, Timothy McVeigh, arguing. There are no groups of Jews, and no groups of Christians, and no groups of Hindus, and no groups of Buddhists pointing to their scriptures to justify violence and committing acts of violence on that basis anywhere in the world today. There just aren't any. What about the Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda? Well, actually, the Lord's Resistance Army, although it is widely touted as another group of Christian extremists, is actually funded by Islamic jihadists in Sudan. And there again can point to no Christian scriptures to justify what it's doing, and does not point to any, in sharp contrast to the Islamic jihadis who routinely quote the Quran to explain and justify what they're doing and to make recruits. So this is why it's insidious, because in the first place, there aren't any. And so the whole idea of having to point to other kinds of extremists before it's legitimate to speak about Islamic jihad is only an attempt to deflect attention away from the reality of Islamic jihad and to create a false moral equivalence between the reality of Islamic jihad, which is thousands of bodies stacked up around the world, and these tiny fringe groups at best who committed isolated acts of violence here or there over a period of years. But it's even worse. People like Linda Sarsour, they know that. And when they talk about extremists of all kinds, there is one particular group that they actually do mean, that they try to portray as being equivalent to Islamic jihadis. You know who they are? Some people are nodding. They're us. The people who resist Islamic jihadis, the people who are opposed to Islamic jihad terrorism, are routinely portrayed by the enablers and supporters of Islamic jihad terrorism as being exactly the same as the jihad terrorists. And so actually, when I myself and my colleague Pamela Geller were banned from entering Britain last year, I got a letter from the UK Home Office. I was sitting in my home office and working, and FedEx comes up, as they often do, but this time the guy says, I need your signature on this. It's the UK Home Office. And I thought, oh, that's it. I'm not getting on the plane tomorrow. And sure enough, it was a letter from the British government saying I was not allowed to come to Britain because I said that Islam is unique among religions in having a developed doctrine and theology and legal system mandating warfare against unbelievers. And because they said I might repeat that in Britain, I was not to be allowed in. Because who knows what would happen if I went around on the streets of London saying something like that. Now, there's several things to this. In the first place, Islam does have a doctrine and theology and legal system mandating warfare against unbelievers. That's just a fact. I'll show it to you in a minute. Not only that, but the week before we were banned, the British government allowed in a Saudi sheikh named Mohammed al-Arifi. And Mohammed al-Arifi is on record saying jihad is tearing the infidels limb from limb and smashing skulls, which is a great honor for the believer. He got in. No problem. What's the difference between him and me? I would suspect that if you asked Mohammed al-Arifi, does Islam have a doctrine of warfare against unbelievers? He would say, of course it does. So how come he gets in and I don't? Because he's for it. And I'm not. So you can get into Britain if you believe that Islam has a doctrine of warfare against unbelievers, as long as you're in favor of it. But the point actually that I'm making here is that by banning us from Britain, the British government actually gave its official endorsement to the idea that we are equivalent extremists. We're even worse than the Islamic extremists because they let that guy in, al-Arifi. And actually in the British media at the time, one of the most infuriating aspects of the whole affair was that people were writing on both sides of the issue, even people writing in support, saying Geller and Spencer should not have been banned from Britain. After all, we have our own extremists here. How can we have our extremists here like Anjem Chowdhury, who is a jihad preacher in Britain, and not let in their extremists on the other side? Okay, so what exactly is so terrible? What exactly is so extreme about what I say? Well, this is the heart of the matter. It doesn't actually have anything to do with me. But the reality is that the title of this talk, if you saw the flyer, if you got the email, it said our self-inflicted wound. And the self-inflicted wound that we have inflicted upon ourselves is the ruling out of bounds of any honest discussion on this issue. And the idea that if we speak honestly about this issue, that there's something wrong with us, that we're extremists. I actually did get to London a few years ago, before they, I guess they found out how extremist I really was. And I did what any tourist would do when you get to London. I went to all the local mosques. And I was in the Finsbury Park Mosque, which you may have heard of. It's very famous for being the mosque of Abu Hamza, the guy with the hooks for hands. He was in his mosque one day and he was making a bomb. I mean, what else do you do? And he's a very pious man, So he's making a bomb, and it went off in his hands, so he had no more hands. And anyway, he was the imam of the Finsbury Park Mosque until he was arrested. And he actually was just extradited to the United States and found guilty of involvement in a plot to create an Al-Qaeda training camp in Bly, Oregon. And anyway, while he was the imam of the Finsbury Park Mosque, he was routinely quoted in the British press as saying all kinds of extremist things. And I went into the Finsbury Park Mosque, it was a few years after he was gone. And I said to the guy there was a very helpful young man there who weighed me down with books, all kinds of books. He was trying very hard to convert me to Islam. He didn't know who I was. And he gave me this Quran among the other books. And I said, I hear that a few years back you had some problem with extremists. And he said, yes, we did, but they're all gone, and we're all moderates now. So he gave me this moderate Quran. And this is a very helpful Quran to have. This is a Quran, it's not just the Quran in English, but it is a Quran with commentary. You know how we're always taking it out of context? That any time you quote the Quran in a way that's unfavorable, you're taking it out of context. So what better to do but to get the context from somebody who would know? And so this Quran actually has commentary by Syed Abu Allah Maududi, Maulana Maududi, who is a Pakistani Islamic scholar and politician. He died in 1979. He's the founder of Jamaat Islami, which is still the largest Islamist party in Pakistan, that is an exponent of political Islam. And he was a great scholar of the Quran. He wrote a multi-volume commentary on the Quran, of which this is a one-volume digest. And if you go into your local Islamic bookstore, you probably have a membership, right? If you go into your local Islamic bookstore, I guarantee you, you will find writings by Maududi. And if you go to islamicbookstore.com or anywhere online, you'll find Maududi. He's very mainstream. He is not an extremist. He is not radical fringe. He is a respected commentator on the Quran from the 20th century. So they gave me this moderate Quran, commentary by Maududi, so now I cannot take it out of context. After all these years, it's like going into AA after being an alcoholic. And the first thing I did was go to chapter 9, verse 29, which says, fight against those who do not obey Allah and His Messenger, and do not forbid what He has forbidden, even if they are of the people of the book, that of course is us, primarily Jews and Christians, until they pay the jizya, which is a poll tax, with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. Now that seemed to be a clear mandate to make war against Jews and Christians until they submit to the hegemony of Islamic law. But let's not take it out of context. Maududi has commentary on it, and he says this: the purpose for which the Muslims are required to fight is not, as one might think, to compel the unbelievers into embracing Islam. Well, that's a relief. It's all okay now. Well, not quite, because there's more. But actually, you know, if you see people on television speaking about Islam, they will say, Islam was not spread by the sword. Islam does not force people to convert to Islam. True, I mean, it's often a law honored in the breach, but nonetheless, it is precisely Islamic law. You don't force people to convert to Islam, you just make it so miserable for them if they don't, that they want to. And that's what the rest of this is about. Rather, its purpose is to put an end to the suzerainty, the rule of the unbelievers, so that the latter are unable to rule over people. You know what that says, so that the latter, the unbelievers, are unable to rule over people in general, full stop. Not latter are unable to rule over Palestine, or lands of Iraq and Afghanistan, or lands that we don't like American foreign policy in. People, in general. The authority to rule, he goes on, should only be vested in those who follow the true faith. Unbelievers who do not follow this true faith should live in a state of subordination. Anybody who becomes convinced of the truth of Islam may accept the faith of his or her own volition. The unbelievers are required to pay jizya, poll tax, in return for the security. You remember, like The Godfather, you know? You pay a little protection, we make sure your windows don't get broken, you got a very nice business here, you don't want anything to happen to them. You just pay us $100 a week. Everything's all right, capiche? The unbelievers are required to pay the jizya, poll tax, in return for the security provided to them as dhimmis, protected people of an Islamic state. Jizya symbolizes the submission of the unbelievers to the suzerainty of Islam. Now, you may say, well, maybe this Maududi, maybe he's more of an extremist than you're letting on. After all, he did found Pakistan's largest political party, but Pakistan's a little loopy anyway, right? Surely they don't take this seriously anywhere else. Pakistan's always been given to fanaticism ever since it was founded as the land of the pure, Pak, right? But we just see recently in Iraq, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, Shams, which encompasses Lebanon, Syria, Israel, parts of Kuwait, all of Kuwait, Iraq and Syria, of course, parts of Turkey, Jordan. That's the state they envisage. The Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant is already collecting the jizya from Christians in Mosul, which they recently occupied, a historically Christian city in Iraq, and killing or raping the people who cannot pay. And so, well, there again, obviously they're extremists. They control a land the size of a nation from Aleppo to Fallujah, but they're extremists themselves. At a certain point, you have to ask, well, how many extremists does it take for the extreme to become mainstream? How many extremists does it have to be before it's not just a radical fringe? We have this Islamic State of Iraq and Syria that broke off from Al-Qaeda. But mind you, the mainstream media will tell you they broke off from Al-Qaeda, but won't tell you that they broke off from Al-Qaeda not because they have some different view of Islam and jihad, but only because of a difference of tactics. When they wanted to go full speed ahead in Syria and Iraq, and Al-Qaeda didn't. So that makes Al-Qaeda moderate now? Now, the problem is that that's exactly the kind of thinking that we do have in Washington. That the Obama administration has been, he was so avid to go into Syria militarily, to aid the wonderful freedom fighters against Assad. Remember that? And then he was giving them weapons. And who were they? Well, John McCain went and he checked them out and they were moderates, right? And he posed for a picture with them. And they were moderates. And now you know what? That picture is being used by the Islamic State of Iraq and Shams as part of their recruitment, one of their recruitment videos. Say, see, John McCain endorsed us. The Obama administration and the Republicans, this is bipartisan cluelessness, they both thought that people who were fighting against Al-Qaeda must be moderates. When actually the split between the Islamic State people and the Al-Qaeda group was that the Islamic State wanted to be even more violent. This is not to exonerate Al-Qaeda in the least. It was just a matter of tactics and strategy. It was not a matter of philosophy at all. But the United States government, in all of its works and pomps, in all of its forms, it always speaks about moderates and extremists. And this whole way of looking at things is out of focus and is leading us into disastrous blind alleys, disastrous policy errors. And it's been going on for years. George W. Bush famously thought, when we go into Iraq and topple Saddam Hussein, they will welcome us as liberators. Well, I hate to say I told you so once again, but not all that much. In March 2003, before we had any troops in Iraq, I wrote an article that you can still find online saying President Bush does not have a realistic plan to bring democracy to the Middle East. He underestimates the loyalty that people will have to Islamic law and to the idea that only Islam should be the governing element of the state. As Maududi says, that the Muslims have the responsibility to fight until they impose Islamic law over the world and to impose their hegemony over the non-Muslims. And so they're never going to accept a democracy that is based on one man, one vote. Because one man, one vote will just be one man, one vote, one time as they vote for Islamic law and become a Sharia state. The problem in Iraq is that you had these different factions that wanted their own hegemony and their own understanding of Sharia. Not that there was a whole lot of difference between the understandings of Sharia. But you had the Shiite Arabs, the Sunni Arabs, and the Sunni Kurds. And none of the three would accept rule from the other. So what we have now happening was inevitable. It was missed, though, because there was no understanding of Islam. It was considered to be the problem of a few extremists who had twisted and hijacked the religion of peace, and that once those people were neutralized, everything would be okay. So we went into Iraq and nothing worked out that way because the way in which the whole thing was conceived from the start was wrong. And Barack Obama became president and made it all worse by actively siding with these other groups, apparently in the belief that if he actually gives them an Islamic State, gives them the caliphate, then they will stop fighting against us. Here again, the man doesn't know anything about Islam. He has a remarkable affinity for it, a remarkable affection for it, a clear idea that Islam is good for a country. I mean, after all, I don't think he's stupid. And it's either think he's stupid or that he thinks Islam is great and ought to be in power in various countries, that there ought to be Islamic law in power. Because that's how he's acted consistently throughout his presidency. But the thing about Barack Obama and Islam was once again that he assumed that these moderate groups would come to the fore when there were no moderate groups. Here we are, how many years after 9/11, and there's no Muslim peace movement. There's no Muslim group that's fighting against Osama bin Laden's understanding of Islam and the Islamic State of Iraq's understanding of Islam. It doesn't exist. Just the other day I saw another article in a long stream of them for 13 years now. It's time for the moderates to start standing up against the extremists in Islam. Well, it's time for us to get the clue that they ain't going to. And they're not going to because they know full well that the so-called extremists have the texts and teachings of Islam on their side. And that if they stand up, they'll be declared apostates and heretics. And their lives could be in danger. So there are plenty of peaceful Muslims, plenty of Muslims who don't want to fight jihad against us. But the idea that they're going to stand up against the so-called extremists and make everything okay, that ship has sailed. They could have done that in 2002 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 and 7, and here it is 14. It's time to stop waiting for that. It's time to recognize the reality of the situation. Now, the spectacular incoherence of the American foreign policy has now been revealed, where Barack Obama wanted to help these wonderful freedom fighters that John McCain said were moderate in Syria, but when they cross over into Iraq, then they're extremists again, and terrorists, and we have to fight against them. So we're giving them weapons in Syria, but if they cross over into Iraq with those weapons, then watch out. Then we will send the Iranians after them and help the Iranians. And the Iranians will stop chanting death to America long enough to accept our support in largesse. Beat back the Sunnis in Iraq, reestablish their Shiite client state there, and then go back to chanting death to America. The thing is that in the Soviet era, we thought that we could win hearts and minds. We thought that we could buy friends. And in many cases, we could buy friends because that's the way the world was in those days. And people were pragmatic. And pragmatism can get you very far with other pragmatists. What we have not recognized is that in today's world, these people are not pragmatists that we're dealing with. They are religious zealots. They're not extremists. They're quite mainstream within Islam. But they are certainly zealots. Now, what does that mean? It means that they're true believers. That they really do think that they are fighting for God. And therefore, they're never going to give it up. They're not going to be bought off. They're not going to be won over. We are never going to win their hearts and minds. Why not? Because in the religion of Islam, if you fight for Allah, you will prosper. If you do not fight for Allah, you will not prosper. If you are an infidel, your place is to submit to the Muslims and pay them money. I just read that to you. If we go to the Muslims and to the Islamic world and say the future must not belong to those who slander the Prophet of Islam. And by the way, here's $1 billion. What does it look like to them? We're submitting to them and paying the money, just like the Quran says that we ought to do. Is that going to make them love us? Is that going to make them do what we want? No. It's going to make them treat us the way they treated the classic dhimmis, with a slap on the neck and a spit in the face. Because they have to be made to submit. They have to feel themselves subdued. And so in the classic dhimmi laws, the dhimmi would go to pay the jizya to the Muslims, and the Muslims would abuse it. Nowadays, we're paying all this jizya to the Muslims and saying that we cannot speak about these things. The future must not belong to those who slander the Prophet of Islam. It's only going to bring about the slap in the face. There is no other alternative. The self-inflicted wound that we have given ourselves is to pretend that this problem is other than what it is. And I saw it even on Hannity the other night, and even Hannity, when he had the Islamic apologist cornered and was trying to get her to say that she condemned these things, he gave her an out. He said, this is a twisting and a hijacking of your religion. And she says, yes, I deplore those who wrongfully use Islam, or something like that. Well, what if they're rightfully using it? That doesn't come up. That's not allowed to be said. And the problem is that when you lie about the problem, when we cannot speak honestly about the problem, we will never solve it. If I have an ailment and I go to the doctor and I say, doctor, I've been having these headaches, and he says, take an aspirin, and I take an aspirin, and I still have the headaches, and it turns out that it was all misdiagnosed because it was something far more serious. If I just keep on pretending that I don't have something far more serious and keep taking aspirin, I'm not going to get better. I'm only going to get worse. It's common sense. Now look, the radical violent extremists. I'll give you another example. Boko Haram. Boko Haram in Nigeria, right? They abducted those 300 schoolgirls and 60 more today. You may have heard, and 31 boys. Yep. Yes. And international outcry about it, right? Everybody's all upset. Bring back our girls, hashtag. Well, can you imagine the jihadis when they went to their Twitter feeds that day, how humiliated they must have felt? Anyway, I saw an inundation of articles, CNN, even Fox, the supposedly good one, saying this has nothing to do with Islam. Wow. Boko Haram has nothing to do with Islam, right? Did you see that? Dean Obeidallah, the Muslim comedian, he's never said anything funny, but he's a comedian. And he wrote a piece saying Boko Haram is not Muslim and it's terribly irresponsible for mainstream media journalists to claim that they are. Well, what are they, Buddhists? Boko Haram, do you know that that's not actually their real name? Western education is sin, Boko Haram. Their actual name is the Congregation of the People of the Sunnah for Dawah and Jihad. Sunnah is accepted Islamic practice. If in Islam you do something that's sunnah, you do something that's acceptable. And Dawah is Islamic proselytizing. So this is an avowedly Islamic group. And what did they do? They kidnapped a bunch of schoolgirls, right? And even more heinously, they didn't just kidnap them, but they said they were going to sell them, and according to some reports, they did sell them as slave girls to the Boko Haram warriors. And you think, well, yeah, this has got to be radical violent extremism, right? Because what religion would countenance kidnapping little girls and selling them into sexual slavery? It's lurid, it's heinous, it's you'd expect that in the National Enquirer, not in the nightly news. So obviously it couldn't have anything to do with Islam, right? Well, the Quran says, you can open your Qurans to chapter 4, verse 3. If you fear that you might not treat the orphans justly, then marry the women that seem good to you, 2 or 3 or 4. If you fear that you will not be able to treat them justly, then marry only one, or marry from among those your right hands possess. What are those your right hands possess?
Slaves.
Sex slaves. They are women captured in jihad warfare who are used for this purpose. Don't believe me. believe Maududi, he's not an extremist, he's a moderate. This expression denotes, he's allowed into Britain. Well, he's dead now, he used to be able. This expression denotes slave girls, i.e. female captives of war, who are distributed by the state among individuals when no exchange of prisoners of war takes place. So a Boko Haram guy reads that and thinks, I'm perfectly within my rights as a Muslim to do this. It's perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with this at all. Then he sees Dean Obeidallah saying, this has nothing to do with Islam, and anybody who says it does is grossly irresponsible. And what does he think about that? Does that make him stop and say, oh dear, I'm doing something grossly irresponsible and linking this Islam, this heinous act with Islam? Do you think that that's likely? Not in the least. What we have is a concerted campaign on the part of the mainstream media to make people think, in the first place, that it is non-Muslims who are linking Islam with terrorism, and that any such link is a manifestation of bigotry and hatred. Now, the upshot of it is that nobody in the mainstream media is quoting the Quran about sex slavery, and there's several other passages too that say the same thing. Chapter 4, verse 24, 33:50. Nobody is quoting those. Nobody is referring to them. Everybody is denying this has anything to do with Islam. Now, why does this matter? As Hillary might say, what difference does it make? Well, it makes a very big difference, because if we cannot diagnose the problem properly, we cannot fix it. When these people write these stories, like Dean Obeidallah and Linda Sarsour and all the many others of them, when they go on television and when they write saying this has nothing to do with Islam and it's only radical violent extremists, they are intending to mislead the American people and intending to make us complacent and ignorant in the face of the threat. That is their purpose, because they know they are Muslims. They know that what I'm saying about Islam is true. They know when Boko Haram kidnaps schoolgirls that there are these passages in the Quran that allow for that. They know. So if they know, what are they doing? They're not trying to convince Boko Haram not to do it. They're trying to convince us not to look at the root cause of it, so that we will not do anything to stop it, so that it can happen again. And we've fallen for it completely, hook, line, and sinker. I used to, before I became an international pariah banned from nations, I used to train FBI. I used to fairly regularly go to FBI, Joint Terrorism Task Force, spoke to military groups, the CIA on one occasion. That was a lot of fun. You know, you have to go in, it's like Get Smart with all the doors. And you go in, you strip to your shorts, and they make sure that you don't have a bomb. And you go into the boardroom, and usually when you go into these places, you know, they have nameplates and everybody's name is there. But in the CIA, it was all just John, Fred, Joe, Tom, just first names. And they thought, why did you, Muhammad, you know, why did you read Muhammad? But anyway, no, that's now. I don't do it anymore. I used to train these people in Islam. I would go in and teach them Quran and teach them about the life of Muhammad according to Islamic tradition and explain to them these things so that they would understand the motives and the goals of the people who have vowed to destroy us. You cannot defeat an enemy that you cannot understand. Even then, though, it was dicey, especially toward the end. I did it from about 2005 to 2010. And in 2010, I was at a military base in Kentucky, I believe it was, and the colonel, the head of the base, the leader, whatever, commander, he brought me into his office and he said, we're very glad to have you here, we're very interested in hearing what you have to say, just don't tell anybody you were here. And that got my back up, I'm sorry, but I just, I'll tell you why, because the Council on American Islamic Relations, which is a Hamas-linked Muslim Brotherhood group, and other groups like it, they have been working for years to make sure that anybody who says the things that I say cannot say them in any significant public forum, and especially to the government. And so I said this to the colonel, and I said, why should a Hamas group be dictating who the US military can listen to and who it can't? And he said, well, I understand that, but don't say it. So I went out and I was kind of hot, and I spoke to a couple of the lower level officers who had brought me there, and they agreed to a kind of compromise position, which they agreed with what I was saying, that we shouldn't allow CARE to dictate to the US military. And so they agreed to pose for a picture with me. And I put it up on my website, Jihad Watch, of me with these two military officers, and I said I spoke at this base, and it was great. Didn't name the base. But CARE found out where they were and made a big deal of it. They made such a huge deal of it, I was amazed. They did they wrote a letter to Robert Mueller, the head of the FBI, saying Spencer shouldn't be speaking to the military. They got a petition going. Jesse Jackson signed it. You know you ride with Jesse Jackson once you did. Anyway, I think Al Sharpton did too. Huh?
Can't speak in Hymietown anymore.
Yes. So I didn't pay too much attention to this, but the U.S. government did, and it became part of a much larger effort to bar anybody who spoke the truth about jihad terrorism from speaking to military, to FBI, whoever. And finally, on October 19th, 2011, the Muslim Advocates, which is a group of Muslim lawyers, and 57 allied organizations, including CARE and other Hamas-linked and Muslim Brotherhood-linked groups, wrote a letter to John Brennan, who was then the director of, who was then a Homeland Security advisor, and of course is now the head of the CIA. And they demanded that I be removed as a trainer, that other people like me be removed as a trainer, and that all mention of Islam and jihad in connection with terrorism be removed from counter-terror training. Brennan wrote back immediately. He wrote back on White House stationery, and you paid your taxes. You know, they have money for their own stationery. Every one of them. Brennan's got his own letterhead. But he used White House stationery on this case, in this case, to emphasize how seriously they took this at the highest levels, and said, not only will we scrub all mention of Islam and jihad from counter-terror training, not only will we fire these trainers, but we will re-educate anybody who was trained by them. Chairman Mao would have been very pleased. And for all I know, they did. But this is the problem. This is the price of what they did there. Now, the U.S. government is officially bound, cannot speak about Islam in connection with terrorism. Right around that same time, in the fall of 2011, the Russian government sent the FBI notice that Tamerlan Tsarnaev was a follower of radical Islam, that's how they put it, and a strong believer, and had tried to join underground groups in Dagestan. The only underground groups in Dagestan are jihad terror groups. Tamerlan Tsarnaev, of course, was the Boston Marathon bomber. But the FBI got this right around the time. Imagine if you're an FBI agent, and you go to work one day, and you get the memo. Islam has nothing to do with terrorism. Never mention Islam in connection with terrorism ever again. Okay, boss. Second memo. Russian government says this guy is a follower of radical Islam and a strong believer who may be involved in terrorism. Uh-oh. What do? Circular file. Because it's too hot. Even if they knew, even if whoever got it in the FBI knew the significance of it, somebody who had not yet been re-educated, even if they knew, they wouldn't have dared to do anything about it. And they made a perfunctory investigation and let it go. And of course you all know Islamic Society of Boston, that Tsarnaevs went there, Afia Siddiqui went there, serving 86 years for trying to kill American soldiers in the name of Islam. Tariq Mahana went there, serving 17 years for aiding Al-Qaeda. Founded by, the Islamic Society that is, founded by Abdurrahman al-Amoudi, who is doing 23 years for financing Al-Qaeda. And of course, when did the FBI go in to investigate this mosque? Never.
Never.
Even after the Tsarnaev bombing of the Boston Marathon, they didn't go in. Congressman Louis Gohmert, an American hero of Texas, he grilled former FBI Director Robert Mueller about this, And he said, yes, we did go to the mosque. We had outreach there. And see, here it all comes back around. Outreach. You see, Mueller wants to deal with the moderates against the extremists. He is duty-bound to believe that any mosque in the United States is full of moderates and not extremists. And so he conducts outreach to the mosque to try to win hearts and minds and make them think, we're not against you. Why does he have to do that? Because of counter-terror efforts that Muslim groups have said are anti-Muslim and discriminatory. And so the FBI, instead of saying, are you kidding? You guys are, the jihad has killed 3,000 Americans on 9/11, and 13 in Fort Hood, and 3 at the Marathon, and 2 in Little Rock, Arkansas, and so many other foiled plots, and you're saying that we can't come in? No, they didn't say that. They said, oh, okay, well, we'll make sure that our investigation of mosques is acceptable to you. And we'll conduct outreach to show you what good guys we are. So, the upshot is, everyone is afraid to deal with this problem truthfully and adequately. And that endangers us all. And I will close with a small story about how deeply this is embedded now in the American psyche. Do you remember the Fort Dix plot?
Yes.
The Fort Dix 6. They were going to go into 6 Muslims around 2007. They were going to go into Fort Dix and kill as many American soldiers as they could before they themselves were killed, and would thereupon go to paradise and meet the virgins and get the reward promised in the Quran. Paradise is guaranteed for those who kill and are killed for Allah. Chapter 9, verse 111. So, why didn't they do it? Were they foiled by the FBI? No, the FBI was too busy conducting outreach. How were they foiled?
17-year-old kid.
Yes, you already know the story. I'm still going to tell it.
She's still on her nose, so tell us.
It was a 17-year-old kid. He worked at a video store. His name is Brian Morgenstern. And he worked at a video store near Fort Dix. And these guys were true believers. They had all sorts of jihad videos, beheadings, bombings, blood and gore. But they had them on VHS tapes. For Brian Morgenstern worked at a video store. They brought in the VHS tapes and they said, would you put these on DVD for us? And he said, okay. It was just another day's work. But he's seeing all this go by, and he starts to get disturbed. And so he went to his commanding officer, he went to his boss, and said, dude, well, he was 17. I'm seeing some weird stuff on these videos. Should I go to the police? Or would that be racist? He said that. They were also white guys, by the way. They were Albanian Muslims. They were whiter than I'll ever be. And yet, he had known. He was 17. You know, he didn't know anything. Pardon the expression. He didn't know about contemporary geopolitics. He just knew that to resist jihad terror, that was racist. How did he know that? From 10, 12 years of it being beaten into us every day. That to resist jihad terror is hateful, bigoted, and wrong. And it's gotten as far as the British government. It certainly encompasses the mainstream media. Barack Obama believes it. And so the only thing we're going to get is more jihad terror. Because people don't want to do what's hateful, bigoted, and wrong. They don't want to see themselves smeared all over the internet with all sorts of horrible charges. And so they keep their heads down and let it all go by. But in the meantime, the jihadis are not letting it all go by. They're still at work. And so unless and until we recover from this self-inflicted wound and start speaking the truth about this, the jihad will continue to advance. And on that happy note, I will pause, and if you have any questions, comments, agreements, disagreements, death fatwas, whatever, then I will take them. Yes, sir.
What would be the catalyst to result in a change in attitude on the part of American leadership and the American public? What would be that catalyst?
Well, what would be the catalyst for a change in the attitude of the American leadership and the American public? You would think that just the pressing events of day to day would awaken them to reality. But I keep being amazed at how much that does not happen. That, for example, John Kerry has said several times that in response to Boko Haram in Nigeria, we have to shower money on Nigeria's government and build roads and houses and schools and such in Nigeria, and that will take away the impetus for terrorism. John Kerry is assuming that poverty causes terrorism, which is, of course, why we see so many Haitian suicide bombers. Poverty causes terrorism is something that has been debunked again and again and again. There's been study after study after study. You can go to Jihad Watch and look for them. Just put in poverty causes terrorism in the search box and you'll find many, many studies over the years showing that jihadis are generally better educated and wealthier than their peers. Besides that, we already tried to cure terrorism by alleviating poverty in Afghanistan. And we built all kinds of schools. They blew them up. It was just another place for the Taliban to have target practice. And yet it doesn't ever seem to sink in. And the same wrong analyses keep resulting in the same wrong policies being applied. And so what is going to wake them up? I don't know. I hope there's not some catastrophe. But what we do need is a massive change in the political culture in Washington. Because the Republicans are clueless, the Democrats are complicit. We have, as it's been often noted, and as Andy put it in dinner before this, we have the evil party and the stupid party. And the evil party is in power, and the stupid party is too stupid to stop them. And so we need to have a tremendous change in the entire political establishment. And how that can come about only by a massive ground roots action, which is why I keep going around doing these talks. But I don't see it any other way that it can happen. Yes, sir?
In response to this question, we see responses in history, and it usually only happens when people get really, really fed up with other people's behavior. And you're starting to see that happen right now in Europe. You've had far-right parties and far-left parties that are both anti-establishment, with the UKIP party picking up seats, but you've had also a far-left anti-establishment party in Spain, and a lot of it is anti-EU because the EU supports immigration. It's allowed Muslims to come into the country or into the EU. So it's a process that does take time. We've seen it, 500 years ago, or however long it was in Spain. We've seen it in Russia, but it takes, as you said, I hope it doesn't happen, a catastrophe, but I think, the more and more crime that gets escalated, more and more atrocities that happen, it's when people are forced to deal with it, and unfortunately, it's starting to happen now.
Well, I'll tell you, as the longer this goes on in Europe, with the establishment parties doing nothing, the more likely they're making civil war and open conflict in the streets. It could still be headed off, but only if they start to take decisive action. And all they're doing is aiding and abetting the problem.
You've seen the Golden Dawn Party pick up seats in Greece, which is a very liberal country. You've seen anti-establishment conservative parties gaining strength. They don't have a majority, they're a very small minority, but they're picking up strength in countries like Sweden and Norway. And countries like Norway are just some of the most anti-Semitic countries in Europe.
Well, I hope that responsible parties can gain power before it's too late. It's getting very late. John?
To strike a positive note, Robert, I just saw a video yesterday of an Arab-Israeli youth. I think his aunt is a member of the Knesset. He's an Arab Muslim Israeli. And he spoke very strongly against the kidnappers of those Israeli teenagers. So I think you start to see it more from where it all sprung from the in the Muslim world. People are just sick and tired of living under this fascism.
Yeah, John, I don't have any doubt that if the United States had gone into Iraq and Afghanistan, excuse me, saying that we're standing for American values, we're standing for universally accepted principles of human rights, we're standing for the rights of women, for the rights of minorities, for the freedom of speech, that a lot of people would have gone along with them. But instead, we installed Sharia constitutions and imposed Islamic law over both countries. It was a tremendous opportunity missed. I don't have any doubt that there are a lot of Muslims who don't want to live under Islamic law. That's part of the reason why we have so many Muslims here. On the other hand, there are, of course, very many who want to have Islamic law here, and that's why they're here as well. It has to be said also, unfortunately, that your example of the Arab Israeli who spoke out, he got death threats from his relatives. And this is one of the problems that we see with Muslim reformers all over the world. There was a Moroccan imam, Ahmed Asib, who just a few months ago, he said, it's terrible how Islam is used to justify violence, and we ought to be preaching peace. And he was immediately declared an apostate and a heretic by the other imams in Morocco, death sentence put out on him, and now he's in hiding. So, when you hear these Muslim spokesmen in the West saying Islam is a religion of peace and so on, and these people are misunderstanding it, they are once again just trying to sow complacency among Americans. They are not taken seriously by Muslim leaders anywhere else in the world, and most of them are onto their game anyway, which is why you don't see death fatwas against CARE and groups like that. It's all just a campaign of deception in the West. Yes, ma'am.
I have actually two questions. I'd like to know what the 17-year-old boy did.
Yeah.
That's number one.
Oh, did I leave that out? Sorry.
Yes, and the other is, why is it I agree with everything you're saying. Why is it a lot of young men mostly are converting to Islam and going over to fight
Yes.
on the side of Islam?
In the first place, the first question was what happened to that kid, Brian Morgenstern. He did go to the police. He decided to go ahead and be racist. And so he went to the police, and we can be grateful to him for doing that because he prevented people from being murdered. But the idea that he would even have paused for a second and have worried about it shows what inroads the jihadis have made into our collective psyche. And the second question was, what is it that makes young men convert to Islam in the West and then go over and fight in Syria and Iraq? Well, there are a variety of answers to that. One is that I think that Osama bin Laden put it best after the Black Hawk incident in Somalia, when Bill Clinton withdrew American troops from Somalia after that. And Osama said he saw that withdrawal and he saw, America's the weak horse and people will back the strong horse. And so now's the time to step up the jihad. And there is a certain thing that people find attractive in strength. A certain kind of person, no doubt. And usually somebody who does not have something else that's strong in his life. You know, people who don't have a strong family, don't have a religion, don't have a sense of belonging or identity. And of course there are millions of those in America today. And they see this thing that stands for something very strongly, and it's very appealing. Also, proselytizers, dawah in America, they lie. They lie to people to get them in. I know this guy, he is an ex-Muslim. He's a convert to Islam, an American convert to Islam, who was actually quite prominent for a few years. Won an award for his writing as a Muslim and so on. But then he left Islam and is now, it's all secret, so I can't tell you who he is, but he left Islam and he was very disillusioned. And he's told me that the Islam that he joined was not what he was told it was going to be. And that they just don't tell you about the violent parts or the prohibition of music or the refusal of women's rights or any of these things. They don't tell you about. And then you get in and it's too late. because it already is operating in a certain kind of cult fashion, cutting you off from family, cutting you off from other ties. So then a lot of people, they feel like it's too late to turn back when they find this out. Yes, ma'am?
Where do you see the Saudis shaking out in all of this? I mean, on one hand, they're scared to death of Iran and some of the stuff, but they also are in bed with the enemy. They're funding some of this. And they've also got a lot of military equipment come from this country. Can they have it both ways forever? Where do you think they're going to shift?
Nobody's going to have it both ways forever. All this is going to come to a head. How? I wish I knew. But the Saudis are in a very peculiar position because they have been funding these jihad groups for years. But at the same time, they're opposed to them because the jihad groups want to topple the House of Saud because they consider it to be apostate. The jihad groups want a caliphate. The caliph is the successor of Muhammad as the political, military, and spiritual leader of the Muslims. The king of Saudi Arabia is not a caliph. And so he has no legitimacy in their eyes. It's not that he's rich and hypocritical and all that. They don't care about that. They care that he is not governing according to the caliphate structure. And so they will topple him if they can. And the Saudis have been playing a double game in that regard for a long time. They had an agreement with Al-Qaeda. They would fund Al-Qaeda outside the kingdom as long as Al-Qaeda didn't operate inside the kingdom. And the Al-Qaeda ultimately broke that agreement and blew up the Khobar Towers. But it may be that they have agreements like that with the other groups, but they've already come out against the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and against the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. And so it may be that they will be the ones who will stand up to this in the way that Barack Obama won't. The problem is that they're fueling it by what they teach and how they raise their children, and so they're not going to be able to beat it back forever.
It just seems that they and the Egyptians, there are certain states within the Arab world that are uniquely positioned to actually do something because they have money, they have military might, and they can claim they too are Arabs and Muslims. And rather than us doing it, there are some players in that part of the country who could have some legitimacy in fighting back.
Well, I certainly have no objection to an Egyptian-Saudi military action against ISIS. That would be just great. And then if the Iranians start fighting them, then as long as the whole thing can be contained there, then what's the downside as far as the United States goes? If they're fighting each other, maybe they'll ease up on the jihads in the West for a while. And they're going to, it sounds callous, but they're going to fight each other anyway. The Sunni-Shiite split is 1,400 years old. We're not going to heal it. Condoleezza Rice said in 2007, the Middle East still tends to think of things in Sunni-Shiite terms. They're just going to have to overcome that. Well, 7 years and we're still waiting. Yes, ma'am. Certainly. That they fight their Sunni-Shiite jihad and we stay out of it. And we protect our interests as much as necessary. But we, in the meantime, develop alternative energy sources with the drilling, with the fracking, with the pipelines, everything. And make it possible for us to be able to steer clear of them as much as we can. Obviously, today, the global economy is interconnected, and so this has to be done in a careful manner. But I believe it can be done. We might as well try to do the right thing instead of keeping on trying to do the wrong thing. And you have that, you have the oil dependence, you have, in the second place, reconfigure our alliances so that no state that oppresses women, no state that oppresses non-Muslims, no state that pumps out the anti-Semitic rhetoric on the airwaves is going to get a dime from the United States. And no state that teaches jihad warfare is going to be an ally of the United States and get any aid whatsoever. So, if Egypt wants the $1.3 billion a year, it's going to have to, in a transparent, open, inspectable manner, have in the textbooks, in the mosques, in the schools, everywhere, not a single mention of jihad warfare, of the hegemony of the Muslims, of the authority of the Muslims, the necessity to wage war and subjugate the non-Muslims. of all the anti-Semitism that's all over the Egyptian airwaves all the time? Not a bit of it. And it's inspected, what, every 6 months or 3 months, however long, frequently it has to be done. Or else, they just don't get it, that's all. They're not the friends of the United States. And I guarantee you, some of these places will be ruled by pragmatists and will clean up the act to get the money. And that will be good in the long run, because you might have a generation or two like Turkey, up until recently, where they were willing to enter the civilized world. Now, of course, it comes back in Turkey because they're re-Islamizing. And they're only going to do that when the vigilance is relaxed. So the vigilance has to always be there. Could that be done? Well, I don't know. Why don't we try? Meanwhile, domestically, every Islamic organization has to give up, renounce in transparent and inspectable ways any intention to bring Islamic law here in whole or part, any intention to do anything to harm, to modify in a way that would be in variance with our rights, the U.S. Constitution, or they're political groups. They're not religious groups, and subject to all the accountability and inspectability of political groups. Yes, sir, in the back.
The immigration policy in the United States, why are we accepting so many refugees from war-torn Muslim nations? How does that whole process work? I saw the mayor of Springfield was even complaining about it.
Yeah, I saw that. That was remarkable. I hope there'll be many more of those. The mayor of Springfield just recently said, can we have a moratorium, please, on these Somali immigrants? I mean, I have a heart too, but these people come in, they drain our welfare resources, they're not adding anything to the community. He didn't say that, but he said it in so many words that, you know, this is just a burden on our city, and we can't handle this. And, you know, it's also creating civil strife that's going to only increase. It's not just that the Somali communities in Minneapolis are sending jihadis back to Somalia. And at a certain point, they're going to get the idea, hey, we can just stay here and wage jihad here. Hey, good idea, Ahmed. How hard is that going to be to figure out? But why is it happening? It's happening by the express design of the Obama administration. If you look at the refugee resettlement program, it heavily favors Muslims. It's very hard, even if you're a Christian from a persecuted area, to come into the United States right now. But very easy if you're a Muslim. And they're bringing these whole communities in. And there's also been all this sort of strife about Islamic supremacism already. You know, there are whole Somali communities in, I believe it's Nebraska and Colorado, in cities there where they're J.B. Swift meatpacking plants. And they demanded prayer times, prayer breaks during the day. And the non-Muslims complained and said, wait a minute, then we have to work longer hours to make up for these guys' breaks. And the EEOC said, yeah, that's right, we do. Because that's equality in the United States today. But see, this kind of thing is going to breed resentment, which is going to lead to strife. And yet it is the policy of the U.S. government. This is another thing that obviously is insane and has to change. Yes, sir?
How did allowing or fast-tracking 30,000 Syrians, even if they had some minor connection to terrorism, into this country?
Just a
minor.
few people.
What does that do to the equation?
It's as I said, it's insane. And there's only going to be more civil strife in America to come with it. Look, we're importing Somalis in the United States. We'll get Somalia in the United States. Somalia is not a variety vacation land. They don't have an illegal immigration problem in Somalia. Nobody's trying to get in. And so we bring over whole Somali communities. It's only natural. They're going to recreate what they know here. Look, and then of course it's aided and abetted by our governing officials. In Lewiston, Maine, not too far from here, there was that controversy in the middle school when the Somalis were all sitting at their Somali lunch table and some obnoxious kid left a ham sandwich in the middle of the table. Hate crime, investigations, sensitivity training, 4-alarm fire, all huge deal for a ham sandwich. Now, you know, I went through 7th grade, you went through 7th grade. It's terrible. People are jerks when they're that age. Present company accepted. And It's only now that it becomes a hate crime and it becomes a thing in the newspapers and something that we all have to be sorrowful about and beat our breasts and wring our hands and cry sorrow because we're such racists. Well, it's 7th grade. That's how they are. But now the situation is so overheated, and it's only going to get worse. Yes, sir.
Al Jazeera Network,
Yes.
what kind of influence is that making in votes?
Well, Al Jazeera, actually, I'm happy to say Al Jazeera America was a big bomb and did not do well at all. And I don't see any signs that it's going to improve anytime soon. There's a big controversy, you may have seen the news recently, about these Al Jazeera reporters who were arrested in Egypt. Yeah. And everybody's all upset because it's a free speech issue. Well, okay, I believe in free speech too. I actually believe in free speech, I'm sure, more than most of the people reporting about the issue in this case. But I also know what Al Jazeera is. That Al Jazeera is essentially an arm of the Muslim Brotherhood. It comes out of the same Qatari organizations that are in with Sheikh Qaradawi, who is a huge Muslim Brotherhood operative. And Al Jazeera has had several of its reporters previously arrested for terror ties. They got all the videos, you remember, over the years from Osama bin Laden, from Zawahiri, from Adam Gaddan. And where did they get them? Why didn't they ever say, hey, we could just follow that guy back to the cave and then we know where these guys are? Never occurred to them somehow. And so it doesn't break my heart if Al Jazeera reporters, it doesn't, actually I should say, it doesn't arouse my skepticism if I see Al Jazeera reporters getting arrested for terror ties. Obviously they are Brotherhood, and Egypt's cracking down on the Brotherhood. And so we can be all upset about free speech in Egypt, but we have to understand that Egypt does not have a tradition of free speech to start with. Egypt does not have a egalitarian, Republican, democratic tradition to start with. It's a various succession of authoritarianisms. And so it's going to be either this group now or the Brotherhood. And at least this group in power now is probably going to be better for women and better for the Christians in Egypt than the Brotherhood would be. So, yes, sir.
Also, elephant in the room, what you said is the problem we have in this country with Marxism, Marxist thought, and what has created political correctness. And until we understand that, we can't know how to cope with Islam has come in and exploited Marxism.
Yes.
And in fact, those are two competing ideologies. I mean, I don't know what the leftists think when the West falls, that their heads are going to be cut off. I mean,
well, yeah. We have a historical example ready at hand of recent vintage. In 1979, the Islamic Republic of Iran actually started as a coalition between the Khomeinists and the communists. You remember? And they had a Marxist prime minister for a while. And he was ultimately beheaded, and the communists were ultimately killed and thrown out of the equation. Yes?
The recent Brandeis thing shows that there's a hierarchy in political correctness, that Islam is the top,
Yeah.
the women is lower, and race is even below that.
Absolutely, yes. Because
So that should teach us about life.
well, at Brandeis, as you, of course, I'm sure you all know, but just in case anybody doesn't know, they were going to award an honorary degree to Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who is a Somali ex-Muslim. And so we saw that even though she's black, that didn't count, and she's a woman, that didn't count. She offended Islam. That was the only thing that mattered. And so Islam trumps feminism and trumps racism. And is at the highest, as you say, the highest of the pecking order of the political correct elites today. So the question a lot of people ask me is, why would the left be undertaking this alliance when they will get their heads cut off once, if they win, if their alliance wins, they will be the losers. And how can they ally with these people who have this fanatical morality that they enforce by beheadings and stonings when they're so immoral themselves? Well, I think the answer to that is that authoritarianism trumps morality. And so even though they disagree on moral issues, they both have a shared taste for authoritarianism. That the left wants to quash all dissent, the left will not listen to the right, the left will not have an honest discussion or debate with us. They only will shout us down and call us racists, and that's it. And close us out of venues and say that we're bigots, and that's the end of the story. And so the Islamic law does the same thing. You're not allowed to criticize Islam. You can't say anything negative against Islam, or your life is forfeit. So they have a shared kindred authoritarianism and a taste for controlling people. And I think that's where the basis on which the alliance is made. Yes, sir?
How do you view Putin and his fight against Islam?
Putin is kind of hypocritical in an opposite way from Barack Obama. They're kind of opposite numbers. I mean, obviously, Putin's a lot smarter than Barack Obama and a lot cleverer, but at the same time,
Obama's the smartest guy in the room.
When he's alone.
Yeah. When you put his teleprompter in, he's already one up. But anyway, he's fighting against the jihadis in Chechnya. Okay, but then why is he helping Iran? And that's just as short-sighted and shows just as much ignorance of the real magnitude of the problem as the American government has shown. So I don't have a whole lot of respect for him. Yes, sir.
Robert, a couple days after the Boston bombing, they had this big prayer service at the cathedral, Cardinal Valley, and other faiths, right? And it was very conspicuous that there was, I believe, I don't know if there was any Muslims there.
Yes, there were.
There was.
I didn't see anyone speaking though. At least.
Yes.
Yes.
There were? Okay, I thought it was conspicuous that I didn't see any. I thought it was
What was the question?
Nasser Wadani from the American Islamic Congress. They had first picked people from Menino's Mosque, the Islamic Society of Boston, and
then Patrick had to pull back the invitation when he found out who they were.
The thing about it is, though, that the fact that they have to make the invitation to start with, it shows how stupid we have all become. Not us in here, but I mean just the general political culture that, okay, there's an Islamic jihad attack. Invite the imam to the prayer service because it's assumed that the imam rejects all this. It's assumed that this is a twisting and the hijacking of his peaceful faith. It's assumed without anybody doing anything to find out. And Lisa Wangsness of the Boston Globe writes these glowing, more than one, glowing puff pieces about Suhaib Webb, the imam at the Islamic Society of Boston. And never once does she say that he says secularism is an insane ideology. Well, what does he want then? An Islamic state in the United States? He's just a moderate. And it's okay. And this is the level on which we're operating. But Suhaib Webb doesn't stop working for the caliphate, working for the Islamic State and against democratic rule, just because the Boston Globe refuses to report about it. Quite the opposite. Yes, ma'am.
Earlier you stated that it might be okay to give financial aid or whatever word you want to use for it to these Muslim countries if they stop treating the racism and hatred in their countries. How can we ever moderate that when right up the street in Newton, Mass, a town that has a large Jewish population, they've been teaching this stuff. They said it's out of the schools, and it's still in the schools according to people who have...
Well, see, we could actually stop that. We just don't have the will to do it. If U.S. governing authorities and law enforcement officials wanted to go into those places and say, you are teaching things that are against U.S. constitutional principles, that are frankly seditious, and we're shutting this school down, they would be completely within their rights. And they could do it. It would just be like going into a school teaching Nazism in 1943, and nobody would have thought twice about shutting it down. And so the thing is not that we cannot, it's that we will not. And when you talk about whole countries, you're quite right. It would be very difficult. But that would be the condition upon which I would say American aid would come. And so if it could not be done, then no aid. Yes, sir.
You see female genital mutilation.
Yes.
Islamic country. I'm from Pakistan. It is in some communities, even in Middle East.
Yes.
Iran history is a victim of it. Do you think does it have a divine sanction? And the second question is that you need 4 witnesses who have seen penetration to establish rape for a woman in the Islamic country. Does it also have divine sanction in Quran?
The questions are, does female genital mutilation have divine sanction in Islam? And does the idea of having 4 witnesses to prove rape have divine sanction in Islam? And the answer is yes to both. But female genital mutilation is not in the Quran. It's in the Hadith, the traditions attributed to Muhammad, where it says that the circumcision is an honor for a woman. And so this is why it keeps happening. And this is yet another instance where we see it happening in the United States. We see it, cases of it in like just the other day, there was the school in Sweden where it was revealed that everybody in this class had had it done in Sweden. And every time these things are reported, it's said, well, this is a cultural practice that has nothing to do with Islam. Oh, excuse me. It's never reported that Muhammad approved of it, that it is sanctioned in Islamic law. These things are facts, but they're always glossed over. If, and see, this is the difference that it makes, if there were an honest public discussion of the Islamic roots of these practices, then we would be able to go into the mosques and hold them accountable and say, you have to teach against this. This is against the law in the United States. We're going to prosecute you for teaching this. But we pretend, we assume they're not teaching it because it doesn't have anything to do with Islam. And so we don't hold them accountable. And so it keeps happening. The 4 witnesses does have sanction in the Quran. In chapter 24, verse 4, it says, those who accuse honorable women of unchastity, but do not produce 4 witnesses, flog them with 80 lashes, and do not admit their testimony ever after. And 24:13, why did they not bring 4 witnesses in support of their accusation? Now that they have brought no witnesses, it is indeed they who are liars in the sight of Allah. The story goes that Muhammad's favorite wife, Aisha, the little girl, she was accused of adultery, and Muhammad did not want to have her stoned to death. He liked her. So he had this revelation from Allah that you needed 4 witnesses to establish the act. But this has oppressed Muslim women ever after, because then you have to have 4 witnesses, or else if they make the accusation themselves, it becomes self-incriminating. And so 75% of the women who were in prison in Pakistan are in prison because they were raped. And they didn't have the 4 witnesses. And so their accusation was incrimination against themselves that they've committed adultery, they go to prison. See, if we could talk about these things in their Quranic derivations, then here again, we would be able to address them in a way that would deal with the root causes and maybe do something positive to stop them. As long as we pretend that the causes are other than what they are, that it's just a matter of radical, violent extremists who have misunderstood and twisted and hijacked Islam, as is the mainstream view, then these things are going to continue to go on.
Sir, it says that you are allowed to beat your wife if they are disobedient.
Yes, that's chapter 4, verse 34 of the Quran.
And how can you define it has the sanction in Quran, and then how you define will be the disobedience?
Well, that's the problem. It doesn't say disobedient. It says those from whom you fear disobedience. So if you suspect that your wife may become disobedient, then you can beat her. That's chapter 4, verse 34 of the Quran. Good women are obedient. As for those from whom you fear disobedience, give them a warning. That's step 1. Send them to separate beds. Step 2. And beat them. Beat them. Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you for coming up here to New England. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
I just want to mention, in the first part of your speech, I took a little concern with what you said about there are no Hindu or Buddhist extremists. But in India, as in the case with Orissa a few years ago, they killed a lot of Christians and chased 50,000 from their homes. And in Sri Lanka, today, there's many churches being burned down, a lot of oppression of Christians, but fortunately they're not exporting it. It's not like they're trying to send it out to the world like they are.
Yeah, I would never say that Muslims have a monopoly on evil in the world. And there are people of all sorts of points of view who've done all sorts of terrible things. The particular instances that you mentioned are reactions against Christians coming in and proselytizing, and those groups take exception to the proselytizing in violent ways.
Yes, right.
Obviously, I'm not in favor of any violence, but as you say, this is not as the result of some sort of violent or supremacist ideology that is making them go out and conquer other people. Actually, they're reacting to what they consider to be a conquest or colonization of their own areas.